Arthur Penwright didn't want to be in Blackwood. The coastal town was a perpetual gray smear against the churning Atlantic, isolated by 10 miles of treacherous, winding road and an atmosphere that felt universally hostile to outsiders. Everything, the clapboard houses, the salt-crusted docks, the very air, felt perpetually damp and carried the pervasive, metallic tang of sea brine mixed with something subtly earthy, like old rot. He was here because of a grim inheritance, the estate and legacy of his great-uncle, Silas Thorne, a man Arthur had only met twice, both times unsettling. Silas had bequeathed him the Blackwood property, specifically the Arcadian Reliquary, a structure less like a museum and more like a mausoleum for bad ideas. The locals avoided the place entirely, their silence when Arthur inquired about the building being far louder than any shouting. The reliquary itself was a monument to Silas's obsessive study of anomalous biology and rejected histories, housed in a towering, turreted Victorian building right on the cliff face. Inside, the air was heavy and thick, smelling of old paper, formaldehyde, and something sharp and subtly organic, a smell Arthur mentally filed as failed biology. The humidity seemed to intensify the scent, pressing it against the back of his throat. The exhibits were a curator's nightmare and a testament to profound scientific misdirection. Glass cases held specimens that defied taxonomy and good taste. A jar labeled deep-sea cephalopod contained a crimson, pulsing mass that bore too many vestigial eyes. Dried fungal stalks grew out of what was clearly a partially fossilized sheep's skull. Silas Thorne had obsessed over the intersection of folklore, paleontology, and evolutionary anomaly, documenting every sample with maddening, dense handwritten labels that referenced the Arcadian mythos, a bizarre pseudoscience that claimed Earth's history was cyclical, interrupted repeatedly by great, cleansing floods. Arthur was working through Silas's poorly organized study on the ground floor, tasked with creating an inventory before he could legally dispose of the whole, cursed collection. He was dusting the wall behind a towering, mahogany bookcase, a piece so heavy it seemed to be load-bearing. As his cloth scraped along the dusty wood, he noticed the back of the case didn't quite meet the wall on the right side. A thin, dark seam ran vertically, too precise to be simple structural settling. Curiosity, that oldest and most foolish of impulses, took hold. He spent 20 minutes maneuvering the antiquated piece, straining against the immense weight, scraping the heavy base against the brittle wood floor until it grudgingly slid a foot to the side. What was revealed was not plaster or the expected floral wallpaper, but a dense sheet of matte, unpainted steel. The door was industrial, an imposing slab of cold iron bolted shut by 3 visible, heavy-duty tumblers and utterly out of place in the century-old coastal museum. There was no standard handle, only a recessed section for leverage and a small, archaic circular locking mechanism next to a circular indent the size of a teacup. The steel was freezing to the touch, and Arthur felt a faint, almost subsonic vibration against his palm, like a deeply buried machine running constant, slow cycles. A shiver traced its way up his spine, unrelated to the chilly dampness of the room. The Arcadian Reliquary was not just a collection of mistakes. It was a cover for a secret. A very deep, very cold secret that Silas Thorne had taken extraordinary, expensive measures to conceal. He reached into his pocket, where he carried the heavy, ornate iron key found wrapped in Silas's will. It fit the archaic lock perfectly. With a slow, grinding sigh, the tumblers released. The heavy steel door, unseen for decades, yielded with a painful, drawn-out shriek of rusted hinges, a mechanical sound of absolute violation that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the heavy silence of the earth. Arthur braced the edge with his shoulder and stepped through the gap. The air changed instantly. It was not merely cold, it was damp with a suffocating, inorganic humidity, charged with the brittle scent of ozone, the metallic tang of old machinery, and the sulphurous rot found only at the deepest reaches of the ocean floor. The light from the museum hallway did little to penetrate the darkness ahead. He located a pull chain just inside the frame and tugged. A single, heavily caged incandescent bulb flickered into life, barely illuminating the scene, a brutal, unfinished coil of concrete stairs descending into a pit of blackness. This was not a basement. It was a vertical shaft drilled into the heart of the bedrock. Arthur began the descent, each step a jarring echo against the concrete. The temperature dropped steadily, and he could feel the shift in atmospheric pressure pushing against his eardrums. The Blackwood air, thick with salt and fog, was replaced by a sterile, pressurized envelope, air that felt filtered and recycled, yet carried a deep, underlying biological stench. He estimated he traveled at least 70 feet below the museum's foundation before the shaft abruptly ended in a broad, semicircular chamber. This was Silas Thorne's inner sanctum, his hidden cathedral of transgression. The room was vast, clearly blasted and carved from the natural granite, yet overlaid with terrifyingly modern industrial hardware. Thick copper conduits crisscrossed the ceiling, humming with heavy current, and the walls were lined with filtration units that pulsed with a steady, mechanical heartbeat. The floor was rough, oil-stained concrete, sloping gently toward a central drain. But the architecture was secondary to the contents. Arranged in the semicircle were 8 cylindrical tanks, towering 12 feet high, bolted securely to the floor and ceiling. They were reinforced with steel bands and thick, industrial-grade glass that warped the contents slightly, like looking through thick, antique diving goggles. These tanks were filled with Chronosol. The liquid inside was not water, but a heavy, viscous fluid, the color of burnt umber and sickly dark honey. It pulsed faintly, lit from below by internal lamps that gave the whole chamber a dreadful, amber glow. It was a silent, captive ocean, an artificially sustained environment for life that should never have been. Arthur moved slowly, his breath fogging on the cold air, stepping closer to inspect the contents of the Chronosol tanks, his curiosity wrestling brutally with overwhelming, panicked revulsion. In Tank 3, the specimen defied classification. It was a perpetually twitching, gray mass of tissue, resembling nothing more than a giant, pulsating internal organ. It had no limbs, no head, no skeletal structure. It was just muscle fibers suspended in the Chronosol. Yet, embedded almost perfectly in its center, dominating the entire amorphous form, was a single, immense eye. It was distinctly human in structure, retina and iris perfectly formed, but scaled up to the size of a dinner plate. The eye was fixed on Arthur, following his movements with unnerving precision. It was a conscious being that had been reduced, or perhaps elevated, to nothing more than a singular, perceiving orb of flesh. He backed away, his throat tight, only to be confronted by the next horror in Tank 5. This specimen offered a clearer biological reference, making its transformation all the more sickening. It was clearly derived from livestock, perhaps a sheep or a goat, but its limbs had been subjected to impossible pressures. The hind leg floated slightly off the tank's floor. The wool had been stripped and replaced by taut, pale, almost translucent skin, glistening unnaturally under the amber light. The hoof was gone. In its place, the bone had fractured and reshaped, terminating in a terrifying, multi-jointed raptorial claw. 5 talons, slick and dark, clicked lightly against the inside of the glass as the Chronosol solution shifted. It was a limb evolved instantaneously to kill and tear, a tool perfected for a prey species that had lost all trace of its innocence. Arthur felt a wave of dizzying nausea. This was not taxidermy or archaeological forgery. This was forced, unnatural evolution orchestrated by a mind warped by esoteric knowledge. The final specimen, in Tank 7, nearly broke him. It was massive, taking up most of the tank's vertical space. It was a fish, recognizably a bottom-dwelling species, perhaps a catfish or monkfish, but it had grown to the dimensions of a small shark. Its head was a nightmare of fused bone and cartilage, the mouth a gaping vacuum surrounded by thick, vibrating barbels. Most horrifyingly, its skin was not covered in scales or slick mucus. Instead, the entire creature was armored in a dense coat of fine, brittle, white filaments that looked like crystallized bone fibers, a living coat of tiny, microscopic skeleton protruding through the skin. It wasn't swimming, it was hovering, its enormous, black eyes staring blankly at the glass, perpetually gulping the viscous amber solution. He realized the horror wasn't just in their appearance, but in their condition. They were not dead specimens preserved for study. They were alive, struggling for breath and existence in this chemical slurry, the Chronosol keeping their distorted biology functioning against every natural law. Arthur stumbled back toward a steel workbench littered with arcane instruments, crucibles, delicate dissection tools, and thick leather-bound ledgers. He needed context, an explanation, anything to anchor the sanity that was rapidly dissolving around him. He ran his hand across the bench, searching, until his fingers brushed against the spine of a massive, heavily stained journal. It was bound in rough, oil-tanned leather, the front marked not with a title, but with a disturbing, hand-drawn symbol, a spiraling helix that terminated not in a point, but in a crashing wave. This was Silas Thorne's personal, terrible record. He pulled it free, the leather cold and stiff, and recognized the title scrawled across the aging cover in faded ink, The Flood Chronicle. The air in the subterranean bunker had thickened into a physical presence, clinging to Arthur's lungs with the damp, sterile musk of decay and old science. He backed away from the pulsing vats, their amber fluid seeming to watch him, and found a small, antique mahogany desk tucked against the wall stained black with ancient mildew. On the desk lay a single, heavy volume bound in cracked, waterlogged leather that looked less like a journal and more like a theological artifact. Its title, embossed in faded gold leaf, was simply, The Flood Chronicle. Arthur's fingers trembled as he opened it. The pages within were thick, almost parchment-like, filled with Silas Thorne's sprawling, increasingly erratic handwriting. The initial entries were intellectual and academic, detailing a radical, horrifying synthesis of young Earth creationism and applied xenobiology. Silas was not a mad scientist seeking dominion. He was a delirious theologian attempting to rewrite Genesis. June 14, 1965. The world remembers only the second coming, the great deluge that wiped clean the slate for man. They forget the first age. The Arcadian reliquary is not merely a collection of strange fossils. It is the evidence of the pre-Adamic life, the progenitors who were too massive, too pure, too connected to the primordial consciousness of the planet to be truly drowned. They merely awaited the recession, asterisk. The script grew darker, the ink bleeding in places, suggesting entries made hastily or under duress. Arthur realized the Chronosol was not a weapon, it was a nutrient bath, a catalyst designed to reverse engineer evolution. August 3, 1965. The strain is achieving cellular memory regression. The terrestrial fauna, when introduced to the Chronosol, does not mutate forward, it reverts. It is shedding the skin of the last 60 million years, discarding the shackles of atmospheric breathing, readying for the environment of the source water. We are preparing the vessels, asterisk. Arthur turned a page and a chill that had nothing to do with the bunker's temperature gripped him. The next section was dedicated entirely to a vast, reinforced steel structure Silas referred to as the stasis chamber, the ultimate goal of the entire laboratory. September 19, 1965. The progenitor does not sleep. It waits, held in a state of suspended animation by the sheer density of time itself. The Chronosol, when applied correctly, breaks down the temporal inertia. It prepares the atmosphere, thins the barrier. The chamber is sealed. But soon, the host will require air. And then, it will require a body, asterisk. The final entries were barely legible, scratched onto the page in a frenzy that mirrored pure, unadulterated terror and euphoria. This was where the biological horror gave way to something far more insidious, the spiritual infection. Silas detailed his final tests on laboratory rats. October 1, 1965. They are no longer ratus novegicus. They are fleshy, pulsating things with gills that breathe hydrogen and human lungs that gasp for the air of the first age. But the horror is not the form, it is the voice. The newest specimen, designated T9, developed full human vocal cords within hours. It did not speak English. It did not speak any language known to man. It whispered. And what it whispered was not sound, but a commandment, asterisk. Arthur leaned closer, reading the final, terrifying lines detailing the T9's speech. Asterisk. The sound was water rushing backward, the collision of deep-sea sonar and ancient basalt. It commanded, simply, open the way. Feed the hunger. Prepare the shell. The sound is infecting me. I understand the logic of the flood now. It was not a punishment. It was a harvest. And the time for the reseeding is upon us. The journal abruptly ended. Arthur closed the volume, the thick leather thudding softly against the desk. He felt sick, not from the stench or the sight of the vats, but from the realization that Silas Thorne had deliberately sought out and welcomed an entity whose nature defied comprehension, an entity that demanded the wholesale genetic erasure of life on Earth. He looked up from the desk. Directly opposite the vats, recessed into the cavern wall, was the object of Silas's final, horrifying obsession, the stasis chamber. It wasn't a door. It was a sheer wall of welded, riveted metal, easily 15 feet high, secured with hydraulic pistons thicker than Arthur's torso. It looked less like a secure storage unit and more like the hatch to a sealed nuclear bunker, or perhaps the lock on a tomb. A faint, constant vibration emanated from the metal, a subsonic hum that resonated through the floor and into the soles of Arthur's boots. Driven by morbid curiosity and a paralyzing sense of fatalism, he walked toward it, lifting a shaky hand to touch the cold, oil-slick surface. The moment his fingertips grazed the cold steel, the humming ceased. It was replaced by silence, but not the absence of noise. It was the presence of an enormous, invasive mind. A bolt of pure, corrosive thought slammed into the front of Arthur's consciousness. It was not a sentence or an image. It was a sensation so profound it bypassed every sensory filter. He tasted salt and decay, felt the pressure of miles of crushing water, and the consuming, relentless, ancient contempt for the fragile, air-breathing life forms currently inhabiting its surface world. Open it! The command was absolute, bypassing reason and seizing control of his motor functions. Arthur felt his knees lock, his arms begin to strain forward. He felt the entity's blinding hunger, a cosmic vacuum desiring the warmth of blood and the cellular integrity of a fresh host. You will unlock the seals. You will prepare the host. Arthur screamed, but the sound was choked off in his throat by the sheer mental force. He was fighting his own body. He could feel the alien will forcing his hands toward the intricate combination lock on the door's central axis. The Chronosol strain, the genetic decay, the transformation into a suitable vessel, was already working within him, weakening his biological defenses and opening his mind to the source. He stumbled backward, fighting the psychic gravity pulling him toward the metal wall. The entity was projecting its need, flooding him with visions of a green, watery planet where massive, bony structures rose beneath a chlorine sun. Obey. 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 In a final, desperate act of self-preservation, Arthur hurled himself sideways, slamming his head violently against the rough concrete base of an empty shelving unit. The impact was sickeningly sharp, momentarily eclipsing the intrusive thought stream. Pain exploded behind his eyes, a welcome, blinding light of purely human trauma. He collapsed to the floor, the metal walls still vibrating faintly, the residual psychic echo pulsing against his fractured skull. The taste of copper filled his mouth. He lay there, half-conscious, his body convulsing as the shock tried to undo the psychic contamination. Just as the darkness began to claim him, a sound filtered down from the bunker ceiling, a sound that did not belong, the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel above and the muffled, authoritative tone of a human voice. "Sheriff, I don't see any sign of a break-in, but the door was wide open, like he just walked right in." "You sure about this?" "It's the Thorne place." "I'm sure, Dale. The kid's rental car is parked right by the museum." "Shaw, you take the perimeter." "I'm going in." Arthur tried to call out, to warn them away from the horror that lurked in the silence, but the darkness rushed in, heavy and irreversible, muffling the approach of law enforcement and the terrifying pulse of the stasis chamber. The metallic tang of ozone and old blood was the first thing Arthur registered. He woke with a gasp, his head splitting, finding himself sprawled on the cold stone floor, the open Flood Chronicle pages scattered around him. His vision swam, slowly resolving the horrifying sight of the massive steel door still vibrating, and two figures standing over him. Sheriff Dale, a mountain of distrustful muscle in cheap denim, scowled down. Beside him, Deputy Shaw, younger and visibly pale, held a trembling flashlight. "He came to the station raving, Sheriff." Shaw's voice was strained. "Said he'd locked himself in here. Thought it was just a bad reaction to the smell." "It's not the smell," Arthur choked, scrambling back against the chemical vats. The immediate, searing memory of the psychic invasion, the overwhelming sense of scale, the hunger, the command to open, made him claw at his throat. "You have to leave. The door, the large one, it's not sealed, they are waiting." Arthur tried to distill the cosmic horror into palatable information. Chronosol, Silas Thorne's insanity, the things in the tanks, the ancient entity communicating through the walls. It came out as hysterical gibberish. Dale folded his arms, the skepticism radiating off him like heat. "Look, kid. We know Thorne was crazy. Everybody in Blackwood knows that. But this is just an old museum basement. There's no cult, no monster, just 8 tanks of expired chemicals. The tanks are a facade. It was a pressurized barrier, a dam. Silas wrote that the door leads to the stasis chamber, a place where the rules of time don't apply, where the ones from before the flood were kept." Dale ignored him, taking 2 measured steps toward the immense, sealed vault door. It was a flawless sheet of 1/4-inch steel, secured by 8 redundant bolts, a piece of engineering that spoke of vast expense and paranoia. "This thing hasn't been opened in 70 years, kid. You hit your head, you had a nightmare. Now we're going to walk you out, and you're going to spend the night drying off in a cell until we figure out who authorized you to mess with Thorne's relics." As Dale placed a beefy hand on the cold steel to push off, the air abruptly died. It wasn't a sound or a scent, but a sudden vacuum of reality. The lights in the basement flickered violently, plunging them into darkness before sputtering back to life. A low, grinding resonance began emanating from the steel, a sound too deep for human ears, felt entirely in the chest cavity. Dale snatched his hand back, swearing, his face paling beneath his tan. "What the hell was that?" "It's here," Arthur whispered, burying his face in his hands. "It wants the door open. It demanded it." The resonance intensified, shifting into a high-pitched, metallic shriek, and then the unthinkable happened. The steel door began to buckle. Not at the hinges or the seals, but the flawless, solid metal plate itself. It concave inward, groaning in defiance of physical laws. The massive bolts began shearing, snapping free with pistol crack reports. Deputy Shaw screamed, raising his revolver. "Stay back!" Dale roared, drawing his own weapon, though the futility of aiming a 9mm slug at sheer, dimensional force was painfully obvious. As the metal peeled back, violently tearing itself from the frame, a strange, unseen pressure slammed into Sheriff Dale. It wasn't a physical blow, but a massive displacement of force, like standing too close to an underwater explosion. Dale's heavy body was thrown across the room, slamming into the concrete wall with a sickening crunch before dropping motionless into the Chronosol spill beside one of the tanks. The door, now ripped and mangled into a horrifying flower of jagged metal petals, groaned one last time and swung open. A frigid, pale blue mist immediately flooded the chamber. It smelled sharply of ozone and salt, but beneath that was something indescribably ancient, the scent of deep rock and primal, untroubled water. The humidity in the Blackwood basement evaporated instantly, replaced by the profound, alien cold of the chasm. Deputy Shaw stared, rigid with shock, his flashlight beam struggling to pierce the glowing fog. "Sheriff!" Shaw rushed forward but immediately recoiled. The air pouring from the opening was not breathable. It was heavy, dizzying, and caused the skin to prickle with electric static. "He's dead," Arthur stated flatly, the shock momentarily replacing the terror. "He's just a victim of the pressure difference. We need to go, Shaw, now, before whatever was sealed in there comes out." Shaw, however, was already edging toward the opening, adrenaline overriding self-preservation. "I have to see what killed him!" Against all sanity, Arthur found himself following. The tunnel beyond the vault was a short, steep descent into an environment utterly divorced from the world above. The blue mist thinned to reveal a vast, intricate network of caverns, but these were not natural geological formations. The walls twisted and bulged, as if the rock itself had been softened and molded like clay under impossible pressure. Stalactites and stalagmites intersected at impossible angles, and the air was subtly wrong. Here, Arthur sensed the temporal distortions Silas had recorded. Sound echoed at a delay, and the shadows seemed to stretch and compress independently of the flashlight beam. "Where are we?" Shaw gasped, clutching his weapon, the light beam dancing nervously over the crystalline growth. "The stasis chamber. The waiting room." They moved deeper, navigating through pathways that shimmered faintly. They were no longer in Blackwood, or even on Earth as they knew it. Then they saw him. Silas Thorne had found the peace he craved, or perhaps, the integration he had sought. He was not a corpse lying on the ground. 20 feet ahead, where the cavern ceiling dripped with thick, crystalline formations, Silas was fixed. His body had become one with the rock. His spine was fused into a thick stalagmite, his ribcage spread wide, acting as a horrifying biological trellis for the mineral growth. His flesh was translucent and pallid, yet his eyes, or rather, the crystal structures that had replaced his eyes, were directed toward them. He was a living monument, a bioflag announcing the entity's victory. As Arthur and Shaw approached, a voice resonated in their minds, clear and profound, carrying none of the frantic madness of Silas's journal, but rather a cold, assured certainty. Asterisk. The vessels are inferior. The Chronosol was weak. It merely prepared the ground. Asterisk. It was Silas's voice, yet devoid of his personality, merely a vessel for the ancient truth. Asterisk. The flood is here. The world is being remade in the image of the deep. The Creator desired new skin. I have prepared the gateway. Asterisk. Arthur stumbled back, choking on the fear, but Silas's fused mouth did not move. It was pure thought projection, relentless and massive. Asterisk. You are a satisfactory vessel, Arthur Penwright. You are already permeable. The nurturer will guide you now. Asterisk. Before Arthur could process the meaning of those chilling words, a shadow fell over them, a shadow that absorbed all the light from Shaw's beam. It rose from the mouth of a deeper, wider chasm, blocking their escape. It was easily 3 meters tall, moving with the sluggish, seismic weight of a creature that had been sleeping for epochs. Its skin was thick, mottled gray, resembling wet basalt, stretched taut over a hyperdense skeleton. This was the Proto-Goliath. It walked upright, its massive arms ending in splayed, heavy-knuckled hands. Its head was small relative to its colossal torso, yet it was dominated by massive, jagged structures of pure white bone that rose like a crown of warped antlers. It possessed no apparent eyes, but Arthur felt utterly scrutinized, measured, and weighed. It did not make a sound, but the feeling of its presence was overwhelming, raw, unadulterated hunger. A hunger not for simple sustenance, but a fundamental desire to consume and replace, to overwrite reality with its own ancient physical existence. Shaw fired. The 9mm slugs struck the creature's chest with hollow pings. They did not penetrate, nor did they slow it down. The Proto-Goliath barely seemed to notice the impact. It merely tilted its massive head, inhaling the ozone-thick air as if savoring the scent of new, fragile prey. Arthur seized Shaw's arm, hauling the terrified deputy backward. "Run! Don't look at it! If it touches you, you belong to the ground!" The Goliath began to move with startling speed for its size, its heavy steps vibrating the cave floor, announcing the arrival of the pre-Diluvian age. Their only path was back the way they came, toward the violated, Chronosol-soaked basement, and the fate that awaited them there. The raw hunger of the Proto-Goliath was not merely a physical sensation, it was a psychic cavity that threatened to hollow out Arthur's very bones, leaving only a residue of terrified submission. He and Deputy Shaw scrambled backward, the immense creature's presence acting like a gravitational pull toward oblivion. The tunnels, previously only claustrophobic, now seemed to actively shift, the mineral walls weeping a thin, oily brine that smelled of sulfur and deep-sea decay. "Move! God, just move!" Shaw roared, his voice thin against the grinding echoes of the giant's approach. They were running blind, relying only on the slight upward slope that indicated the direction back to the laboratory. Arthur felt a searing pain in his lungs. It was not the burn of exertion, but something chemical. He coughed, and the phlegm he spat out was dark and viscous, smelling distinctly of the acrid amber solution that filled the Chronosol vats. The contagion was already taking root, a silent, parasitic passenger accelerating through his bloodstream. Shaw was faring worse. His face was flushed an alarming crimson, and he kept scratching furiously at the skin of his neck, muttering about a pins and needles sensation that was rapidly intensifying. They burst back through the heavy steel door, slamming it shut and throwing the crude iron bolt. The relative silence of the subterranean lab was deceptive. The air pressure had shifted dramatically while they were below, destabilizing the already fragile containment units. A high-pitched, metallic whine dominated the space, emanating from the banks of the Chronosol reservoirs. "The tanks are failing," Arthur gasped, clutching his chest. "We opened the main vault. The whole system is collapsing." 8 massive glass cylinders stood before them, now weeping tears of thick, amber Chronosol. The fluid ran down the steel supports, pooling on the concrete floor, mixing with the dark stain where Sheriff Dale had fallen. The odor was now overwhelming, rotting meat mixed with industrial bleach and the sharp tang of chemical ozone. "We need to get out! Now!" Shaw yelled, moving toward the spiral staircase, but Arthur's eyes were fixed on the specimens. The pressure inside the vats reached a critical point. With a synchronized, wet cracking sound, the glass shattered. The Chronosol strain was released. It was not a clean break. The glass fractured inward, the pressurized amber solution erupting in geysers, splashing across the lab. As the liquid hit the open air, the biological specimens housed within reacted with horrifying speed. The grotesque, pulsating block of muscle and fused eyeballs did not merely slump out, it unfolded, rearranging its dense tissue into something resembling a torso, though misshapen and listing. The mutated lamb's chi suddenly extended, the fused bones cracking and reforming into long, whip-like appendages ending in razor-sharp chitinous hooks. And the vast, whiskered catfish, its body covered in bristly white bone hair, seemed to melt, the aquatic form liquefying into a semi-solid, six-limbed hunter. But the most immediate threat was the fusion. As the Chronosol pooled, the 3 distinct horrors began to flow together, drawn by some inherent, chemical imperative. They merged into a collection of slick, oil-blackened, vaguely humanoid shapes. These new entities moved with a terrifying, liquid grace. They were slick, shiny with the viscous Chronosol residue, and their eyes, wherever they managed to form, burned with an unnatural, sickly yellow light. Their mouths were merely slits, lined not with teeth, but with rows of needle-like metal filaments designed for puncture and extraction. Shaw realized their danger a second too late. He stumbled backward into the wall, trying to raise his pistol, but the chemical haze seemed to clog his reflexes. One of the newly formed entities, gliding low across the floor like spilled mercury, darted toward him. It moved faster than anything Arthur had ever seen, bypassing the remains of the shattered vats. The slick creature lunged, its needle mouth finding purchase in Shaw's thigh. Shaw screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. The creature wasn't biting, it was injecting, transferring a concentrated dose of the Chronosol strain directly into his bloodstream. When the creature retracted, a dark, thick residue bubbled out of the puncture wound. "Arthur! Lighter! Fire!" Shaw screamed, collapsing against the cold stone, the corrosive substance already eating through his uniform. Arthur moved on instinct. He knew he could not fight these things. They were the essence of the ancient Flood, reborn in chemical horror. He yanked the brass Zippo lighter from Shaw's pocket, his hand trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. He flicked it open. The tiny flame seemed laughably insignificant against the overwhelming darkness and the rapidly approaching, needle-mouthed abominations. He had to destroy the entire complex. Arthur scrambled backward, kicking over one of the breached vats. The remaining Chronosol slurry flooded the concrete, flowing directly toward the cavern entrance they had just sealed, mixing with the biological contamination left by the Protogoliath's presence. He flicked the lighter onto the puddle. The ensuing conflagration was unlike any fire known to man. It did not catch wood or paper in a normal fashion. Instead, the Chronosol ignited in a violent, instantaneous chemical combustion. A sheet of dense, luminous blue-green flame erupted, accompanied by a deafening, wet whomph that slammed Arthur back against the wall. This was Chronosol fire, a pure, toxin-fueled burn that metabolized the environment itself. The intensity was unnatural, the heat so immediate and profound that the concrete walls began to smoke and crackle. The air filled with the sharp, metallic scream of exploding chemicals. The slick, humanoid horrors reacted instantly, their yellow eyes widening, their forms beginning to bubble and seize as the blue flame enveloped them. Their biological structure, dependent on the viscous stability of the amber fluid, was instantly destabilized by the heat. They didn't burn down, they melted into sizzling pools of black, smoking tar. But the fire was consuming Shaw too. "Go! Get out! Seal it!" Shaw managed, his voice now raspy and thick, his skin bubbling beneath the intense heat. He was already dissolving, his final moments overshadowed by the grotesque metamorphosis his body was undergoing. Arthur did not look back. The heat was searing his lungs, frying the newly infected tissue. He stumbled onto the spiral stairs, the steel groaning under the force of the detonation below. The blue fire was licking up the stone shaft, creating an updraft of toxic gas and superheated vapor. He clawed his way toward the surface, toward the Arcadian reliquary above. The tremors were immense now. The museum, built decades ago on Silas Thorne's questionable foundation, was finally giving way. Glass cases exploded upstairs. The stench of burning formaldehyde and ancient artifacts mixed with the overwhelming chemical blaze from below. Arthur reached the top landing just as the structural integrity failed completely. The floor of the reliquary beneath him buckled. He threw himself across the threshold and out onto the main showroom floor, rolling past splintered displays of misidentified megalodon teeth and faulty carbon-dated pottery. He scrambled toward the main doors as the entire central mass of the museum shuddered, roared, and collapsed inward. The immense weight of the crumbling structure, combined with the catastrophic chemical explosions below, sent the entire Arcadian reliquary into a grinding, dusty ruin. The blue-green inferno, trapped deep underground, became a choked, violent plume of smoke and debris, burying the entire subterranean complex, the Chronosol lab, the Protogoliath's chamber, and the twisted remains of Silas Thorne, under tons of shattered stone and pulverized history. Arthur crawled away from the burning wreckage, the salt wind of Blackwood biting at his face. He was alive. He was scorched, wounded, and covered in soot and the lingering, sweet metallic residue of the Chronosol strain. He had sealed the gateway. But as he lay gasping on the wet asphalt, coughing up black fluid that smelled exactly like the chemical fire he had just escaped, he knew one terrifying, unshakable truth: he hadn't just sealed the evil away, he had carried a piece of the oncoming flood out with him. The apocalypse was no longer confined to the depths of Blackwood, it was now circulating in his blood. Arthur's return to consciousness was not a gentle easing back from oblivion, but a sharp, agonizing resurgence of chemical burns, inhaled caustic ash, and the profound, bone-deep cold of shock. The sirens had stopped. The roaring of the Chronosol fire, which had consumed the Arcadian reliquary with unnatural, ozone-tinged green flames, was replaced by the low, insistent hum of fluorescent lights and the measured, unnerving beeps of medical machinery. He was in Blackwood General, isolated not just by the usual sterile precautions, but by something far more deliberate and terrifying. His room was pressurized, the air perpetually circulating, thick with the antiseptic smell that masked a deeper, mineral tang, the scent of deep-sea brine and iron. The medical personnel who tended to him did not look him in the eye. They moved in precise, heavily protected steps, encased in disposable Tyvek suits taped shut at the wrists and ankles, full-face respirators muffling their voices into tinny, synthetic whispers. They handled him not with the practiced, gentle detachment of standard care, but with the extreme, fearful caution reserved for highly infectious biohazards. The questions they asked were few and formal. They centered on the timeline of the fire, the location of the bodies, and the contents of the basement. But the tests they performed were obsessive. They were not treating his third-degree burns or the collapsed lung caused by the blast pressure. They were sampling. Swabs were taken from every orifice, blood was drawn hourly, and core biopsies were performed on the smallest patches of healthy tissue remaining. Arthur realized, with a chilling certainty that overcame the lingering pain, that he was not a patient recovering from trauma. He was a specimen, a newly discovered ecosystem under study. He began to notice the changes. The first indication was the taste in his mouth, a persistent metallic sweetness, like licking a battery covered in salt. Then came the healing itself. The skin that had been scorched down to the muscle fiber was regenerating at an impossible rate, but the new tissue wasn't soft. It was thick, slightly slick, and unnaturally resilient. Where the blast had torn away flesh, a dense, whitish cartilage was forming, rigid and fibrous, particularly across his ribs and along his left forearm. It felt like his skeletal structure was extending, trying to patch the holes with bone-like scaffolding. In his waking hours, the faint memories of the Chronosol pit returned, the colossal, bone-horned creature, the mist of ozone, the visceral, impossible knowledge of a time before time. But now, those memories were accompanied by an agonizing, primal hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was a need for density, for mass, for change. One evening, staring up at the acoustic tiles of the ceiling, Arthur understood Silas Thorne's final state, not decomposition, but assimilation. Thorne hadn't just died in the time-warped cavern. He had been folded into the environment, becoming a living flag for the ancient consciousness. Arthur felt that same process beginning in himself. The chemical fire hadn't cleansed him, it had simply fused the Chronosol strain deeper into his very DNA. He was the next conduit. His skin took on a faint, bruised gray hue, and the constant, internal itching was a manifestation of cellular warfare, or perhaps, cellular agreement. The nightmares were the worst, dreams of being submerged in mile-deep black water, where the pressure should have crushed him, but instead, merely shaped him. He heard the whispering voices from Silas's journal, the language of the Flood Chronicle, not as sounds in the air, but as tectonics shifting in his inner ear. One of the few constants was the night nurse, a woman named Nurse Kelly. Unlike the day shift technicians who were rigid with fear, Kelly possessed a morbid, detached curiosity. She would enter his room precisely at 3 a.m. for vital checks, moving slowly, her presence a silent pressure in the highly filtered air. Her respirator obscured her face completely, but her eyes, visible behind the plastic visor, were strained and tired. On the third night of Arthur's confinement, Nurse Kelly entered, pushing the rolling tray of testing equipment. She paused by the bedside, adjusting the fore-drip, her movements practiced and automatic. "How are we feeling tonight, Arthur?" Her voice was a flat chirp through the suit's speaker. "Like I swallowed an anchor," he rasped, testing his thickened throat. She gave no response, simply marking the chart. She then leaned over to retrieve a blood sample, her bulky, triple-layered biohazard glove brushing against the newly formed, chitinous ridge on his forearm. Arthur felt a momentary surge of energy, a physical jolt that was immediately followed by a wave of nausea and cold. As Kelly straightened up, the movement caused her to cough, a deep, wet, uncontrollable hacking that shook her entire frame. She pressed the sleeve of her suit against her mouth to stifle the noise, a reaction Arthur knew was utterly forbidden in the contamination protocols. When the fit subsided, she pulled her hand away. Arthur watched, frozen, as she adjusted the cuff of the heavy protective glove. There, sticking to the exterior layer of synthetic rubber, was a smear of thick, viscous fluid. It was not blood, nor mucus, nor sputum. It was translucent, the color of old amber, and faintly luminescent under the harsh fluorescent light. It was Chronosol fluid, expelled from a host. Nurse Kelly didn't notice. She meticulously sealed the blood sample and turned toward the pressurized door, her back to Arthur. Arthur's heart ceased its desperate, irregular pounding, replaced by a terrible stillness. The fluid had come from her, passed through her lungs during the coughing fit, deposited on the glove she thought was protecting her. The protective suit, the rigorous isolation, the meticulous protocol, it was all a pathetic, porous defense against something that didn't need breath or touch, only proximity. He hadn't needed to open the metallic gateway in the Chronosol pit, he was the gateway. Silas Thorne had sought to unleash the deep ocean god through ancient magic and technology. Arthur Penwright, burned, healed, and fundamentally remade, was delivering it through biological courier. He was the zero patient. The contamination had leaked. It was in the hospital ventilation, on the surfaces, and now, unquestionably, inside Nurse Kelly. He realized that the relentless physical changes inside him were not merely symptoms of sickness, but the final, necessary evolution required for him to survive and spread the flood. Blackwood was lost. The world outside, the world Arthur had fled, was next. Lying on the sterile bed, trapped in a container designed to keep the infection in, Arthur Penwright smiled a slow, horrible smile. It was the smile of the truly inevitable, a grimace shaped by thick, tightening tissue, an expression of profound, primordial satisfaction. The Chronosol strain had successfully breached the perimeter, not with a roar, but with a simple, quiet cough in the middle of the night. The Kaingwin Hua new era had begun.